Oh, music is wrapping up, which means it's time to get this show on the road. Thank you, everybody, for spending part of your Wednesday with us. We are really, really excited to be able to talk to all of you. My name is Gwen McGarry. I am a Senior Creative Director at M&R, and I am really excited to be joined by some amazing colleagues, Lauren Gonzalez from our digital fundraising advocacy team, the amazing Amanda Person from our advertising team, and one of our newest colleagues, Nihal Mahmood, who leads our research efforts. We are just very excited to get to a jam-packed webinar with you all. It's my job to remind you of some logistics. So first, we're going to have some space for questions at the end. Please use the Q&A feature to pop in your questions. That helps me keep things organized. I definitely welcome continued introductions, comments, other like fun insights in the chat. Just be sure you check, type your message blue box that defaults to hosts and panelists. I would love to see what you say, but if you could just update that to everybody, it ensures that everybody can see the message that you're sending. All right, so people are continuing to introduce themselves. That's excellent. Let's move on to the next slide. So a little bit about M&R for folks that don't know. We are 150 some very talented, passionate people, including the folks that you see here joining me today, that work exclusively with nonprofits to bring change into the world. And the best part about my job, on the next slide, you'll be able to see that we get to do that on behalf of some pretty incredible clients, a few of which are represented here, and I also see a few of them represented in the attendees list. So thanks for joining us. Before I pass things over to my colleagues, I wanted to share two things I'm working on right now I am particularly excited about. The first is Scout Quest, which is our data co-op. Data co-ops can get kind of a bad rap because there's some are kind of questionable about data privacy. What I love about Scout Quest is that it allows you to reach more warm leads while still respecting folks' privacy, which is of course really important. And if you're looking for leads ahead of end of year, which I suspect is a lot of you, the deadline to enroll and get your data back before Giving Tuesday is coming up pretty quickly. So click on or go to quest.mrss.com to find out more information about that. The other thing I wanted to make sure I told you about today is M&R Win. I don't need to tell anybody on this call what a big deal next year's elections are. M&R Win is our new one-stop campaign strategy shop that marries like high-level strategy with experienced high-impact campaigning. So if you are a campaign, an organization that's looking to up your game in 2024, or you need to do that and you don't know where to start, I hope you'll get in touch with my colleagues at M&R Win. All right, let's get started. I'm going to pass things over to Nihal.
Nihal, that had to happen. I know. I'm sorry. Hi, everyone. I'm Nihal Mahmood. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the Senior Manager of Audience and Method Research here at M&R. I've been here for about 4 months now, but over the past 7 years, I've conducted extensive quantitative and qualitative research for a wide range of brands across so many industries, including consumer, healthcare, tech, and corporate. I've also taught market research as an adjunct professor in my attempt to inspire the next generation of researchers. I'm not quite sure how successful I was there, but it was a great experience. I'm also really passionate about representation in research because that's something that's sometimes overlooked in the research world. And I strongly believe that inclusive research is effective research. Before we get started, I wanted to get a quick sense of your familiarity and comfort with research in general. So a poll should pop up on your screen here so that I can conduct some research live and learn more about you. Give it a moment here and have people complete that. And are we able to share the results of that? It's okay if we can't. I will learn on like the back end and see how everyone responded. But thank you so much for those who did complete the poll.
We can report back later in
Yeah.
the webinar.
Great. And so now talking about, oh, here we go. Awesome. It looks like there's a lot of people who appreciate research and are looking for ways that they can use it. Awesome. Some super fans here. Also, some people that get overwhelmed and feel intimidated. That's totally natural as well as some newbies and people who rely on experience and gut feel. Okay, hopefully I totally win you over, but we'll see. Thank you so much for participating. Okay, so when it comes to research, we at MNR firmly believe that the monolithic approach to any audience is not sufficient ethically or effectively, because people who share similar demographic profiles can have entirely different values, experiences, and perspectives. And so if we're serious about developing audience smart programs and strategies, we really have to evolve the way that we understand those audiences. And that means relying less on assumptions and stereotypes or even past experiences and anecdotal interactions, and more on what those audiences are telling us through their behavior, reliable data, and their own words. This is especially important today when things around us are changing so quickly. If you look at like the pandemic, the climate change, and the effects. And so what may have been true 6 months ago isn't the case now, and it could really affect people's perceptions and their behaviors and values as well. And it's also because people can surprise us. And that's one of the reasons I love my job so much. Research can really open your eyes and challenge your assumptions when it comes to truly understanding your audiences and what matters to them most. So what does that mean for your organization and your messaging? Well, we know that your messaging must be 3 things in order to be successful. The first is that it needs to be rooted in your audience, not just who they are, but where they live, what headlines they're reading, what they do in their free time, how they're feeling, and what they're hoping for. It's important to note that we see this work not as censoring your audience, but rather really understanding them. The next is that it needs to be irresistible. The tightest turn of phrase is meaningless if it doesn't actually connect with a person and motivate them to act. Through creative testing, we can identify the right ways to package your messaging so it's heard and remembered. And lastly, it needs to be impactful. Once your message is out in the world, we rigorously track the effect it has on your audiences to ensure your message is making the most impact. So that's a lot, but where do you start? Oh, and also, yeah, research is really key for each of these elements, and that'll be clear as I work through this. So the first thing that we really need to do is understand our audience. Some tend to want to jump straight into the fun part where you conduct your own research, and honestly, that's my favorite as well. But a landscape analysis really helps you build a strong understanding of the current state of things. So this includes not only reviewing the research and reports that your organization has on hand, but also looking at any publicly available studies and papers out there. We layer on social listening to learn about what your audience is talking about and the particular themes and sentiments that are prevalent on the various social media platforms, as well as scan news coverage to see what the tone is and the ways a particular topic is presented. Additionally, we may use an audience insights tool that lets us tap into nationally representative audience data. So all of this information is stuff that you can get without conducting your own research. And all of this combined gives us a holistic view of your audience from different angles and allows us to get up to speed on what's been asked and answered so that when we launch research of our own, we can pose questions that go beyond the surface and really lead us to insights that drive impact. So we've completed the landscape analysis. What's next? I would say quantitative and or qualitative research. I always say that there's no cookie cutter approach to research. So the next step really depends on what we've learned through the analysis and what more we need to learn. Quantitative research, which is basically surveys, helps us understand the what and gives us an opportunity to reach out to a large sample of people. Because of this, the findings are generally representative and actionable, which means that you can confidently use them to help guide your strategy because you have that larger group. Qualitative research, on the other hand, is more exploratory and it's usually conducted with a much smaller group of people. Think of focus groups or one-on-one interviews. You're trying to learn more about why people think and feel the way they do, and this can also provide additional insight into what you've learned during the quantitative research phase. So for me, for example, a lot of times we ask all of these questions in a survey and then the responses really puzzle us. Like we totally thought it would go one way and not another. That's a great opportunity to follow up with qualitative research to kind of dive deep into the whys and why people feel a particular way or why they behave a particular way. You wouldn't want to base an entire strategy on a few conversations, and hopefully that's self-explanatory, but it can really help provide a more in-depth understanding of your audience. Now, whether it's quantitative or qualitative, we always want to make sure that we're providing an engaging experience to participants. This helps them feel comfortable enough to openly share their perspectives, but it also improves the quality of the data you're collecting because you're capturing their interest and they're paying attention. So thinking of the scenarios that we're trying to avoid are like people that are just clicking through on surveys or just randomly clicking things versus actually reading what you're asking them and responding accordingly. Or for example, if you're having conversations, you really want people to feel comfortable, and so that what they're sharing is a true reflection of their experience and their values. The last thing I want to touch on was that touch on audience research is that you can use your findings in so many ways beyond just informing your messaging and your strategy. So you could learn about a new opportunity for programming, for example. You can leverage the data to position your organization as a thought leader, whether that's through publishing the findings in a report where you tell the story of the data in a more visual way. Maybe you're referencing the data if you're presenting at a conference or are being interviewed by the media, or even sharing the results as a way to garner media attention and hopefully get some coverage and exposure that way. Okay, so audience research tells us who our people are and gives us insight into what they need to hear. But in a crowded digital landscape with so many things competing for our audience's attention, it's really crucial we understand how to present that message so it's noticed, absorbed, and remembered. So organizations often don't know whether an email, an ad, or a campaign concept will really resonate with their supporters until they launch it. So that frequently wastes time, money, and goodwill on a concept that doesn't necessarily inspire or motivate. Pre-market creative testing lets you get ahead by helping you understand how your creative performs before going live, so that you can focus your resources and efforts on creative that holds a higher likelihood of success. And this is just an example of Swayable, which is one of the testing platforms here, and it shows the concepts that increase people's likelihood to donate. And then tools like Swayable and Grow Progress let us test messaging, campaign concepts, names, logos, designs, and copy by measuring how different kinds of content influence participants' perceptions and future behaviors, all while comparing the results to that of an independent control group that's exposed to unrelated neutral content. So this really helps us identify which messages are most compelling for your audiences and which could cause a backlash effect, again, without having to go live to learn this in real time and hopefully like to avoid any embarrassment, if any. We also have the ability to see how different audience segments respond to content, which is always a good thing, especially because we all know that no audience is a monolith. So what tools are we talking about? Oh, so many. You can see here that some are almost exclusively used for understanding audiences, like MRI Simmons for audience insights or Talkwalker for social listening. On the other end of the spectrum, we have tools that are more oriented towards pre-market creative testing, such as Swayable and Grow Progress. In the middle, we have a bunch of survey platforms that work for either use case, depending on what you're trying to achieve. And then just to review everything, here, the audience research is really to learn more about the audiences we want to engage. So that's done before we test the messaging and before we come up with the messaging. It can include looking at organizational research and materials, publicly available research, social listening, scanning media coverage, and using an audience insights tool. You can also build on that using online surveys, digital discussions, virtual focus groups, and in-depth interviews. And then in comparison, message testing is really to learn which creative or messages drive impact. So that uses the learnings from audience research to inform your brainstorming and your messaging. So you're not really just grasping for straws or kind of going with what you thought worked in the past. You're really basing it on the data that you learned about your audiences. It helps identify which messages persuade and which cause backlash. And then testing tools include Swayable and Grow Progress.
What I really appreciate about Nihal's approach to research is that, yes, of course, she encourages us to dig in and get our hands dirty and conduct our own research, but she's also given me a greater appreciation for how to use research that's already out in the world, whether it's looking at polling data or getting a pulse on the media headlines to better understand our audiences at a much lower cost to be able to put that together. Now, I think one of the best ways to understand the tools that Nihal is talking about is actually see them in action. And so in the slides that follow, we're going to dig into how we've been using these tools and clarify for giving, understand their audiences, and raise more money.
Hi, everyone. My name is Lauren Gonzalez. I am a senior account executive here at M&R. And like Gwen was saying, I work in our digital fundraising and advocacy department. I also do a bit of ads work and also message testing and audience research. So let's get into our first case study. Like many organizations, our client knew that they had too much to say and in too many ways and needed help focusing on the most persuasive language to share their work and their stories. Does more detail help or hinder response? Are stories distracting or engaging? Are some parts of their work just too complex to share? Through numerous rounds of usability testing, we were able to determine first which parts of their organization best engage supporters, so like service delivery, policy change, and movement building, and then what language was most understandable and inspiring. So in each round of testing, we presented descriptions of the program in short, long, and story form, and then we asked users to rank their understanding and interest of the different aspects of the program from low to high. We also had participants give a description in their own words what they thought the text meant. And then throughout the testing, we never repeated audiences. However, the audiences that we did target were prospects with a very high likelihood of giving to this organization. Now, it's important to note that these results are for this specific organization at a specific moment in time. And so organizations need to do their own research to know what works for their specific audience. So we can talk about the learnings. So when we were looking at if people understood the programmatic work with short descriptions for service delivery, the answer was yes, but for everything else, not really. Then when we were looking at the long descriptions, service delivery and policy change was a yes, but movement building was a no. Then when we depicted the work through individual stories, it was yes across the board. So the movement building, though, was still kind of challenging to talk about, but the stories, we found that the stories were the best way to communicate this complex work. So our top line insights here are not surprising. We saw that stories just perform better in every way for all of the different programmatic areas, and were just better understood and more inspirational to those likely supporters. For the service delivery, we saw that performed well with the short descriptions, long descriptions, or stories. And for all of the other like programmatic areas, we just saw that stories and storytelling were the most impactful. And then one thing to note that we typically find with a lot of organizations is that several words and phrases were confusing to likely supporters. A lot of the times we're using jargon in our work to talk about our work. And many times this communication is confusing and we think that people know what we're talking about, but really they don't. So that is an important thing to take away as well.
I think Lauren, as she sort of alluded to, is a Jill of all trades around here. And one thing she's particularly good at is taking results from studies like this and helping clients translate those findings to talk to supporters across channels. But the exciting thing about research is that it can also help us understand and persuade even seemingly unpersuadable groups of people, as Nihal will share in our next case study.
Yes. So for Feeding America, we launched a multi-year project to learn what message frames and creative will help shift perceptions of SNAP among a persuadable segment of conservative audiences to soften the ground for positive SNAP policymaking. We used a variety of approaches, from surveys and focus groups of voters and Capitol Hill insiders to understand perceptions of SNAP among policymakers and the general public, and pre-market creative testing to measure reactions to creative and make changes to concepts before rolling out through paid media, to seeing how effective messages and creative were engaging audiences on Facebook and Instagram, and brand lift testing to gauge how audiences exposed to our ads perceive SNAP before and after seeing creative. We then tested the child development asset again a year later to determine if it still resonated with voters. It remains the top performer with an almost 5 percentage point lift in support for SNAP and an almost 3 percentage point lift in support for SNAP beneficiaries among the moderately conservative and very conservative audiences. We also tested localized content, developing variations focusing on children in Florida, in addition to the more generic nationwide content. Calling out a specific state tended to resonate more with our conservative audience. Lastly, we also found that text-based imagery tended to outperform images of people, and using validators like the Associated Press article was extremely effective in persuading conservatives. Using these results, we developed custom localized content for grantees to use in their ads, as you can see here. And then we didn't stop there with testing. We later wanted to test the durability of the creative against opposition arguments. So we created 4 video concepts. One was a narrative video using B-roll on SNAP's benefit for children. Another was a selfie-style food bank narrative recorded by Viviana from the Atlanta Community Food Bank. One video was specific to Georgia as an initial test of state-specific creative that highlighted the benefits SNAP brings to local economies. And one was PragerU style, was a PragerU style voiceover video. So it's a creative style that's commonly used by conservative advertisers and likely one our audience was familiar with. So we tested those video concepts against an opposition video based on materials from the American Enterprise Institute to really understand how our content could inoculate voters against opposition arguments they were hearing. So the opposition video was created solely for this use and was only used in a closed testing environment. I'm just going to play it here.
Last year, the Biden administration increased the benefits for SNAP residents by more than 20%. That's up to $20 billion taxpayer dollars being added each year. That further disincentivizes low-income households from working. And data shows that SNAP recipients spend nearly a quarter of their funds on sugary drinks, frozen foods, and desserts, all linked to heart disease and obesity. Continuing to expand SNAP won't reduce the number of people who are hungry. It only increases the unemployment crisis and America's obesity epidemic.
So when looking at the results, our results show that the selfie-style food bank narrative was the most effective, having the largest increases in support for SNAP, support for expanding SNAP, support for beneficiaries of SNAP, and self-reported likelihood to take action in support of SNAP among the moderate and very conservative audiences. This speaks to people's trust of food banks as messengers and the power of authenticity. I'm just going to play it here as well.
My name is Viviana and I work at our local food bank in Atlanta. I believe all my neighbors should be able to feed themselves and their families, especially if they fall on hard times. Every day at the food bank, we help thousands of families put food on their table. But hunger is a massive, massive problem, not just here in Atlanta, but across the country. For every one meal we provide, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, known as SNAP, provides 9. SNAP helps families get the food they need to be healthy and get back on their feet.
However, the Georgia-specific video was also powerful in its local market, performing on par with Viviana's video in Georgia specifically. So we learned that localization is powerful. And here's the video for that.
Georgia, don't get left out. According to the USDA, every dollar in Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program benefits increases the GDP by $1.50. That's more money to local businesses and farmers right here in Georgia. Helping those who have fallen on hard times is part of being a good neighbor. It also makes good fiscal sense.
And so our top line insights here are: first, test against conventional wisdom. While Feeding America often relies on photography to invoke connection, a well-worn best practice, text-based creative outperformed creative with images of people. Sometimes conventional wisdom doesn't always yield the results you expect. The second is leverage FOMO, or the fear of missing out. Our Don't Get Left Out Georgia video integrated an urgent, almost competitive tone that activated people's inherent fear of missing out. And the video was a top performer in our research. Lastly, validate if what's been working for you still works. So invoking child hunger, localization, these are tactics that worked for Feeding America pre-pandemic and that have continued to be effective. Test, and test again to see if your go-tos are still potent, especially in different contexts with different audiences.
Excellent. I love that case study because it reinforces something that Nihal said at the beginning, that people can surprise us. And frankly, sometimes the thing that we think is going to work in testing actually doesn't, which reinforces the value of being able to test our assumptions. Speaking of assumptions and speaking of testing content, I know a lot of us are starting to think about fund performance as we prepare for end of year. I think back to school is usually the time when I start panicking about what should we be doing for end of year. So the next two examples we'll look at are going to show how research can help you really vet and refine your fundraising content before you even press send to help you maximize your performance.
All right, so let's look at the next case study here. Our client was refreshing their sustainer language, and we used creative testing to find out what was the most inspiring and why. Through numerous rounds of head-to-head tests, we tried everything, but one thing stood out. So let me explain quickly the type of language variations that we tested. We had donor aspirational identity, which was language like be the person you aspire to be by joining us. We had the super bold, modern, and fun language that was like a bold new way to give. There was the benefits of giving, which sounds like you would think, receive X, Y, and Z premiums or communications when you join. And then the straightforward facts were like, here's what's happening, here's how we do our part. When we were testing, we tested 2 language variations head-to-head, and then we tested each variation head-to-head against another variation to make sure that we were doing our due diligence in order to validate the results. So for example, we might test the donor aspirational identity against the modern, and then donor aspiration identity against straightforward, and etc. So while we saw some winners-ish, the bigger story is that we saw people respond to pieces of the content rather than the whole thing, which we learned through their comments. Participants even mentioned throughout the testing, like the specific parts that jumped out to them. So the takeaways, users were responding to specific language in each variation. And interestingly enough, a statistic really moved these potential supporters. And that statistic was only 1.6 of all charitable donations make it to organizations dedicated to this organization's cause. So for this organization, it didn't really matter which language variation they used as long as they used this specific statistic.
Hi, I'm Amanda Person. I'm going to jump into our next case study, which is around Planned Parenthood. But just an intro of me, I use she, her pronouns. I'm located in Nashville, and I'm an associate creative director at M&R with a background in digital fundraising for nonprofits. And a lot of my work has been in the international relief space. For the last several years, I've been working with Planned Parenthood to tackle ongoing issues around abortion access in the US. So today I'll walk you through our approach to message testing before and after the Dobbs decision. I'm sure most of you know that Dobbs versus the Jackson Women's Health Organization was the Supreme Court decision that would essentially overturn Roe v. Wade. We knew it was coming and we were prepared for the worst case scenario. And Planned Parenthood really wanted to be on the forefront of the response. So our job at M&R was to prep supporters to mobilize. So we developed a series of surveys, pre-market creative tests, and focus groups to figure out how we would mobilize supporters when the decision happened. And then the leak happened, which actually gave us a really unique opportunity to test the things that we were learning in our message research. And in between the leak and the decision coming down, we were able to transform those learnings into meaningful strategic decisions. And we've continued to iterate on those and learn. So pre-leak, before the leak happened, we wanted to dial into Planned Parenthood's supporter base. We knew this was coming and we really wanted to understand how much they understood about the case, if they knew how it would impact them, and ultimately if they cared. We knew it wouldn't be enough to simply make content. And Planned Parenthood doesn't use research to validate the things that they already know or have said for years and years, but rather using what we've learned in research to inform our program strategies and our overall messaging and make decisions from that. Of course, we suspected that people were going to be outraged, but we needed more information on how we might be able to direct that anger and in a way that would be useful to our long-term programming work, which is obviously required to restore abortion rates. So we started our research, building upon an already extensive research from Planned Parenthood's brand team, and tailored our approach to supporters and donor audiences. In research prior to the leak, supporters generally felt like they couldn't do anything to affect change around the decision. But we found that being more specific and being as specific as we could, the better the overall results would be. So we started a pilot using ads to recruit supporters. From there, they would receive a peer-to-peer text within 24 hours of responding to an ad. Then a volunteer would invite them to a welcome call. And finally, when they're really warmed up with lots of specific details about what they can do to help, they would be invited to plug into local volunteer work with the affiliates. And then when the leak happened, we were able to scale that program and it worked really well. It was a tangible thing that supporters could do that would help with local volunteer engagement and longer term power building. So as we continue to prepare for the decision, the leak presented a really unique opportunity to help us crystallize how supporters would be reacting the day of. Given the moment, we decided to test some very specific message frames to help determine what different groups of supporters may or may not need or expect from Planned Parenthood in that moment. So for example, we saw that audiences under 35 needed a very different messaging treatment than those over 55, which is not totally surprising, right? We used pre-market testing tools, Swayable specifically, to determine what these differences were and if they were significant enough to make changes in the approach for each different audience. Ultimately, the findings helped us prioritize our messaging and determine when to best flight in specific messages for each one of these programs. So based on everything we learned from our research prior to Dobbs, we were able to set some hypotheses to guide continued research with Planned Parenthood supporters and donors. We'll dig into that over the next few slides, but the spoiler is that some of these were on point, some weren't, and some of these worked out in pre-market messaging, but not in market, which is always a fun surprise. Here are some of the most important things we learned from the overall results immediately following the decision. So you can see there is a significant uptick in the number of people saying that they wanted to donate if asked. There was a dip in folks that wanted to take action, like writing to their representatives, talking with friends and family about the issue, or sharing articles. And there was a decrease in the number of folks who wanted to volunteer, which is obviously mixed results, but super exciting for fundraisers. And organizers were like kind of bummed, wondering what they were going to do next. But when we look into the demographic breakdowns, we saw some more optimistic numbers. For example, folks under 35 said they'd be more likely to take action on behalf of Planned Parenthood rather than folks over 55. And BIPOC supporters were significantly more likely to volunteer. With these learnings, we're able to customize messaging and creative for in-market ads, emails, and SMS campaigns that motivate those specific audiences to take action and ultimately, make some of our organizers happy. Okay, so you remember those hypotheses we talked about a few slides ago. These are the results. Using these learnings, we're able to set a comprehensive messaging strategy for Planned Parenthood rooted in data that can move people from outrage to action, whether that's volunteering, donating, or writing to their representatives. We're also able to arm our local affiliates with this information so that they can make more informed decisions about their messaging strategies.
All right. Amanda won't say this herself, but she was really critical in helping Planned Parenthood rapidly run research in the midst of a very chaotic and very challenging moment, so Planned Parenthood could effectively activate supporters and donors into the asks that were most needed at the time, which was really, really essential to helping them navigate that moment. Now we have one more case study we're going to talk about, and then we're going to kick it over to you all to ask questions. So please add your questions to Q&A. We added their questions. I see you. I am not ignoring you, and we will pass it over to our presenters to answer those questions in a moment. But Lauren, hit us with our last example.
Y'all, we have made it. Okay, this case study for this particular client was trying to seek the answer to this question. How can we increase the personal connection donors have to the cause while upholding guidelines around dignity for program participants? We used usability, survey, and focus group tools to seek answers from current donors, internal prospects, and external prospects. So the types of questions that we asked were like, here's some information, communication, and benefits that sponsors told us they might be interested in. And then we gave them a list, and then we asked them to check up to 3 to say like which ones were the most interesting or appealing. So I'm curious what you all think. Put it in the chat. What benefit do you think was the most interesting or appealing for folks? And I'll give folks a minute to decide. Okay, y'all ready to find out the answer? The answer was you're all wrong. So interestingly enough, when we did the research, it told us that we couldn't figure out the messaging from doing research. There were no clear winners, there were no clear losers. Everything was middle of the road. In the end, we actually just had to move forward with what we thought was best and just see how like the current audience would respond to it. Sometimes this is the case. We just have to roll out with something and see how our audience reacts to it. So while this is interesting, it's actually not that surprising. This is one of many examples of what people say is not what they do.
The alternate title of this webinar is Research is Very Humbling. All right. I'm going to pass it over to some of the questions that we've gotten over the course of our conversation today. And I want to first ask this question from Marion. I think, Nihal, like this is a question that is near and dear to your heart, which is, how can we test messaging for smaller organizations that don't have the big budget for a vendor like Swayable or Grow Progress?
Oh my gosh, yes, Gwen is so on point with this being near and dear to my heart. I feel like research should be accessible regardless of whether your organization is big or small. And I totally recognize that Grow Progress and Swayable do is a larger spend. And so I think another way to approach this is doing the testing through a survey platform. You can do it really like on a basic level, really simply. Like if you don't have the survey platform, I mean, there's some free options out there. But we also keep budgets in mind when it comes to determining the best approach and trying to find something that fits best to your budgets and your needs. So I'd say like trying to do a makeshift test through one of the survey platforms is your best bet. And ultimately, like some research is better than no research. So I don't think you have to have all the bells and whistles. It's not about putting your full, like all of your efforts towards research, and you have to do everything from A to Z in order to find value in it. So I would definitely recommend kind of going that survey route just to get some insights that can help guide you.
Anyhow, this slide is lovely, but we can probably just stop sharing the screen so people can see our faces while we're answering these questions. And while we're disabling screen sharing, next question, speaking of small organizations, a question from Shannon is, I'd love to hear your thoughts on how smaller nonprofits can find enough people to test their messages or approach on, especially for things like the multi-step testing processes that you were talking about. Nihal, do you want to speak a little bit more to like how you find the people to test on?
Yeah, and so there's a lot of they're called panel providers. They basically provide sample for you to be able to test it with a specific audience. I will say, I mean, I'm not loyal to any platform out there. So if you're kind of going with SurveyMonkey and just going with their audience, there's a big markup there in the cost when it comes to using that platform. And so sometimes like working with us, we can actually give you a better price and better options and better analysis when it comes to that. But there are panel providers. Some of them, like SurveyMonkey, integrate it into their platform, and so you don't have to do all the behind the scenes work. But we work with panel providers individually to make sure that you get the best cost.
All right, I want to ask this next question. I think, Lauren and Amanda, I'm really curious for your thoughts on this. This is a question Emma raised, and there were some great suggestions in the chat, but I also want your opinion. Emma says, my team gets really bogged down in A/B testing, namely that they only matter if we just change one element of the A/B test. Emma's argued that we don't know our audience enough to create meaningful experiments through just A/B testing alone. The capacity, or more wide questions, or just looking for like any advice on what's worked for you all when it comes to A/B testing.
I feel like for me with A/B testing, a lot of the times we may just be testing one thing against another to limit the amount of variables, but sometimes you also can just do a package test and test like a lot of things against a control and then do some due diligence later down the road to see what actually made the difference. So it doesn't have to be one or another, but definitely sometimes package testing is the way to go if you need to make changes more sooner. Yeah.
Yeah, I would agree with that, Lauren. I think that can also apply in the ad space, where if you use a single control that you know works really well for your audiences, then you can iterate off of that, or you could just blow it out and say, like, we're going to do something completely different and test it against this control that we know works really well. So that way you can move faster in figuring out like what works, what doesn't work. I would also say, like, if you don't know about your audiences, there are ways that you can sort of dig into that as well. We do some things here that allow us to sort of dig into who's in your audience. Like, what does the makeup look like? Are they renters? Are they homeowners? What tax bracket do they fall into? What are their ages? Things like that. so you can get a better understanding of like who they are and where they're coming from and what their life perspective is.
Thank you. All right, our next question is from Dina, and Nihal, I feel this is for you. Dina says, I'm curious if you can talk about the process for selecting folks that you're surveying or interviewing. And you talked a little bit like where you find people, but Dina's also wondering if there's like an ideal number of people to interview or survey.
Yeah, the number is really interesting because a lot of people think that you need to have a large sample size. Like I'm thinking of like 1,000 plus in order for your results to be reliable, and that's not necessarily the case. And so we basically try and aim for a sample size that's going to be statistically significant, and that's just based on there's like some calculations on the back end, but it's just really based on like the prevalence of that audience in the U.S. So we're not trying to survey everyone because that would just that would be a census. But there is basically if there's an audience that is less prevalent, like really like you have a lot of characteristics and they're only like a small percentage of the U.S. Going with a smaller sample size is the way to go because again, you don't need a larger group to have that statistical significance. Sorry, having struggles with that word today. And then if there's an audience that is more prevalent, you can have like the sample size. But I think if you Google sample size calculator, that also gives you an option if you're trying to DIY this, and it helps guide you through the steps on how many people you should survey. And then for the focus group, sorry, like on the qual side, there's not really a number there. What you'll have is like you'll generally have a number of groups, and so you want to have a number of people that makes it like it is. You can still have the conversation without having people just sitting silent. If you're doing it virtually, the number is generally smaller than in person, just because there's a lot of complexity with like pausing, waiting for someone to finish, knowing when you can speak up and when you can't. But you'll find that after around 2 to 3 groups, similar themes will come up. And then you kind of don't need to keep doing it because you have the insight that you need from that exploratory approach. So again, with the qualitative, it's not about the numbers, it's about understanding those topics, understanding the themes that come out of that.
Thank you, Michal. And I'm seeing some things, Shannon was talking about, how do you like make sure you're not just always speaking to a general audience? I think one of the things that we have found is, yes, like the more we can understand specifically who we're talking about and not treating our supporters as one big clump of people is better, right? Like we know personalization really, really matters. The less we can assume about people, the better. One of the things that we found through doing this research is that it allows us to go beyond, sometimes we see personas like, for your audience, like really loves gardening and, retired, really big, broad group of people. And the research that Nihal and Lauren and Amanda have shared today really shows us that the less we can make assumptions about those group of people and more be able to say, not only do we know that they love gardening, but this is the kind of content that moves them, or this is the reason why they support your organization. It allows us to move beyond that sort of cookie cutter persona and really understand what is that person's relationship to your organization and how can we activate that further to turn them into a sustainer or turn them into a lifelong volunteer. All right, just another quick plug. If you have questions, please throw them into the Q&A. Getting through these now. One of the questions that came up was around landscape analyses, and to riff on it a little bit, like what is helpful, Nihal, actually anybody, like when you're looking at a landscape analysis, what are the kinds of data sources that really have been valuable for you in nonprofits?
I can totally start this off. So again, it depends on what you're trying to learn. For example, if you're really trying to understand, like, for example, you're trying to understand your audience and to develop messaging, one good thing to do is look at organizations that are similar to you and how they're messaging, because you want to be a little bit different, right? So that's just like some keyboard research that you can do, hopping onto different sites, seeing how they're positioning their ads, how they're positioning their work. And making sure that you're playing in a space that's a little bit different, or you're messaging in a way that's a little bit different. there's always a lot of studies that are published in the news. So if you have like a topic, one of my favorite key search terms or search phrases is just like putting in the topic name and putting in the word study and then just going on to like the news aspect on Google, and it'll pop up all of the studies that have come up. And then you can just click, like usually they link to the study, but if not, then you can Google the study yourself and see the full results and all of the data there. That's helpful. And then thinking what else? I think the social listening, like just listening to what people are talking about, especially your audiences, is huge. Like maybe you're really focused on one aspect of your work, but like everyone is talking about something else, and that's something that you've like not really put enough attention on, or it's not really like your primary concern. Maybe it's a good maybe that's an opportunity for you to tap into that to draw more people in so that they see that you're doing that work and the other work that you're really prioritizing.
Okay, we just got a really good question from somebody who was pleasantly overwhelmed by everything we talked about today, which I empathize. And just remember, like, if you are an organization that wants to do work, how do you get started? And I'm everybody's first had to wrestle with this question ourselves.
Yeah, I think getting started. I think when it comes to getting started, again, like just the basics, I think like that landscape is really helpful. Like first of all, take a look at your own audiences. See if you're able, like, is there any information that you're able to garner from that? Is there a possibility, like, is your email list large enough? Even if it's not actually, your email list and your socials, maybe you want to just do an informal survey and just trying to get to know who your supporters are and what drew them to your organization. I don't think research has to be like this in-depth, multi-phase aspect. Like maybe if you're just starting, you just do bite-sized pieces so that you can build on that. And then once you start learning about them, once you start doing your work, you're going to find that you have more questions that you want answered. And maybe that's the time to have like a more comprehensive research approach.
Any other tips or advice, Lauren and Amanda, for getting started?
Yeah, I agree with Nihal. Like it feels really intimidating to get started, but I do think if you can start small, and if you can start with the sort of like, here's one big question that we've always been curious about with our audience, and sort of answer that question, you can sort of start ticking through that list. And then, occasionally go back and sort of like retest that question. Like, is this still accurate? And do we need to sort of like go back and rethink our approach to things? I think that is one of the unique and fun and challenging things about research, is that it doesn't always stay the same for very long. And so retesting is something that we absolutely should be doing.
One other thing I was thinking about in terms of like the types of questions that you want to answer, like the hypothesis that you might have about your audiences or your messaging, is like kind of making a list of all of your assumptions about what your audience cares about with your organization, or what's going to move them. And then when you are actually doing the research, you can kind of bounce those ideas off of your initial hypothesis and see, like, if it's made a difference, or if you've answered those questions, or if your assumptions were completely wrong or right. I think that's probably the most interesting aspect of like research and testing, even if this is not necessarily how you get started, but probably the fun thing about it.
The last question that I'm seeing in the queue is thinking about end of year. This is the time when a lot of us are preparing for end of year fundraising. And this person's curious at like what you should be testing now to get ready for a successful, November and December. Or even just, what should you be surveying? Who should you be talking to? What research should you be doing to raise lots of money at the end of this year?
I can start with that. For me, I think one of the first places, end of year is always a great time for prospecting. We're looking outside of our organizations, outside of our existing supporters and donors. And so really starting to tap into like, who is it that I'm going after outside of my existing supporter base, and how do they respond to my messages? I think that is always the place that I am sort of most curious when we're thinking about end of year, and most urgently want to know like how are they thinking about us, or are they thinking about us, and how are our issues relevant to these folks?
I was just gonna add that like if you haven't done any research previously, like now's a good time to start. It's a great time to test like whether like the learnings that you've learned, like the learnings that you get from understanding your audience and learning more about them, whether that has an impact when it comes to your end of year fundraising. And so I feel like this is a great time to get started.
Right. Well, thank you for joining us. If you are now frantically running home, what should I be doing for end of year? We have a really great webinar coming up on August 29th called Top 3 Strategies You Probably Aren't Doing But Should Consider Before End of Year. That's going to be a really fun one. That's going to be from 1 to 2 Eastern time on August 29th. We'll send a link in our follow-up email just if you want to sign up for that. That way it's handy. Thank you again for joining us. We will send around the link to this recording, and please hit us up if you have any other questions or would like to nerd out more in research like these three lovely folks. We're happy to talk more with you. So have a great rest of your Wednesday, and we'll talk to you soon.